Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing Onibaba, which is a film that came out in 1964. It was written and directed by Kanedo Shinto, who was quite a prolific director in his day. This movie was really controversial when it came out because of the way that it depicts very kind of gritty, realistic situations, and of course there's a lot of sex in it when, for whatever reason, people tend to freak out over that. But by today's standards, of course, this movie is very normal. There's nothing that's, to me, gratuitous or anything that objectifies anybody in unfair ways. To me, it always feels like everything that's happening in the movie serves the story and kind of the overall tone of aggression and viscera. This movie is kind of hard to classify. Some people consider it to be like a period drama. Other people tend to think of it more as kind of a horror film, and I think it really just depends on what you take away from it, how you personally perceive it. But for me, I see it just as a really interesting piece that strips down the human experience, literally and figuratively. It's a great study on that primal inherent sexuality, jealousy, violence, all that juicy stuff that forms the very foundation of who we are. The story is actually based on a Buddhist fable, so it's got a lot of kind of spiritual and surrealistic elements to the film, at least in terms of the way it's portrayed. And, to me, it's a very simple film in terms of structure. It takes place in the 14th century in Japan during the Civil War, and it centers around two women. You've got an older woman whose son is in the war, and you've got her daughter-in-law. They live in this kind of swamp-like area. They're waiting for him to come back, and while they're waiting, they've got to survive on their own in any way that they can. So what they do is any sort of samurai that come from the war and end up in the swamp, they kill them, strip them, and sell their weapons and their clothing for food. They both learn from one of the samurai / neighbors that the son of the mother and, of course, the husband of the daughter-in-law has died in the war. But the tension starts brewing when the daughter-in-law, who is of course the young one, starts to have an affair with the neighbor, and this does not go over well with her mother-in-law. She is extremely jealous because, she's older and nobody really wants her. She becomes very angry and very vicious towards her daughter-in-law, and she starts to make her feel guilty by saying, by having sex before you're married, you go to hell. And eventually she goes to the point where she actually tries to scare her by pretending she's like this spirit of a samurai soldier by wearing this kind of scary mask in the night. So yeah, it's kind of a fable. It's a simple story of jealousy, guilt, sexuality, all of those good things that we see so many times in all kinds of different stories. Really, there's just a handful of characters, mainly just these three, the neighbor, the mother, and the daughter-in-law. And, there's very little dialogue in the movie, so a lot of that viscera that's kind of just seething beneath the surface comes out stylistically, and it kind of offers that balance between the minimalism as well as the very accented tone. There's nothing here that's really difficult to decode or anything like that. To me, this is a very kind of straightforward story in terms of structure and symbolism, but that doesn't bother me at all because this is, as I said, a parable. And those kinds of things, those old stories that we know are meant to be passed down from generation to generation. So there needs to be kind of it needs to have a broad way of expressing all of its themes so that the mainstream can really kind of relate to it. The older woman, the mother in the story, is quite interesting because I see her as just kind of the center of the story in terms of moral ambiguity as well as internal confliction. You feel bad for her because I think a lot of people can relate, like as you get older, the society is not kind to those who age. They kind of just toss them aside. She is upset for many reasons. She doesn't want to be left alone. She doesn't know how she's going to support herself. But I think obviously the most of it is that sexual drive and that feeling of being alone that's really bothering her. Watching that jealousy turn so vengeful is kind of like watching the birth of conservatism in its own way. If you look at all kinds of stories throughout time, when somebody's time has passed and they get a bit older and they're looking at these younger people who are in their sexual prime, in their athletic prime, all of that, you tend to get very jealous and you take that jealousy out on them by kind of guilt tripping them into thinking that your sexual feelings are bad and that you're going to go to hell, this and that. And that's what so many religions are based on, what so much of just society is based on, the system. All of this repression through the ages is built on anger and jealousy. It's just that, you know, if I can't have fun, you shouldn't be able to have fun sort of things. And that is just unfortunately what happens as humans get older. That's just part of our nature. We know that the older we get, the more we're facing our own mortality, and we want all of those precious moments back rather than living in the moment as we should. And so in this lady's case, this mother-in-law, you know, her soul in a way is dying, and all she has is that bitterness that she's just built up, and she's lashing out. And that's really all you need for the crux of the story, and I think it's great. It's kind of the perfect amount of tension to really kind of be unleashed throughout. And I love the fact that it's so, you know, simplistic, because the central themes are broadly encompassing. I also love that it's centuries and centuries in the past, because I feel like, you know, we were much closer to the true animals that we were back then compared to now. Obviously now society and you know, being very civilized has kind of dulled all of that animalistic nature within us, and it's not nearly as strong as it was then, when you had to really focus on like survival of the fittest. You had to fight for yourself to survive. No matter what period you're in, we're still human. So that's why, you know, when you watch period films compared to modern ones, the themes are always so similar, because that basic human condition is always going to be there that we can relate to. So having all that kind of set, as I said, there is that dark undercurrent that is just kind of simmering beneath the surface, and it's all conveyed in the direction. And this film is amazingly directed. It just, stylistically, it just has this very staccato, very kind of percussive feel to it. And you look at the movie today, the way it's shot and just the tone of it, and it does not feel dated at all. I mean, it is just so modern. In many ways, it kind of reminds me of There Will Be Blood, just in terms of the way it looks. And I always wondered if Paul Thomas Anderson drew any inspiration from this movie. Who knows? But I mean, I can definitely see it being a possibility. From the very opening few seconds of the film, you just know that this is going to be maybe a different experience. It's going to be a very tense, very striking piece. You know, it starts off, you see kind of the tall swamp grass just kind of swaying in the wind, but on top of it, you have this layer of very, very discordant music. It has all these heavy drums and this kind of eccentric jazz music that sounds very warped. It's kind of just preparing you for the experience you're about to have. The grass kind of swaying in the wind is something that you see often throughout the movie. It's definitely a constant visual theme that you see, and I love it. It's just so fantastic the way they shoot it in various ways. It, to me, kind of is a symbol or like a representation of just human consciousness, how we can change depending on the situation. We're very tempestuous beings. Sometimes the grasses swing very gracefully and very gently, and at other times it can be really turbulent and vicious, especially during, you know, storms. And then there's this kind of softness, this almost like this undercurrent of sexuality to it. And in those moments, a lot of the grass is just, it's shot in slow motion, and it's really cool. It's very erotic, and I've never actually looked at a movie and thought that grass is sexy, but yeah, the grass is sexy in this movie. And also in the cinematography, it's not just the music, but the cinematography has this sharpness to it, and it feels almost like an early Japanese manga. All of that kind of adds to the intricacy, that there's more to the human, you know, the human experience than what meets the eye. There's also the black hole that is used as a symbol throughout the movie at different points. And that's, you know, it's a very kind of blatant metaphor. There's nothing too deep going on there. I mean, it's the idea of there's that all-consuming kind of black hole within all of us, the idea that we're all going to die, this feeling of impending doom, and that no matter how much we want to be in control, ultimately we're not. And that may seem kind of overt to some people, but I actually really like the metaphor of that black hole, because each time it's utilized in the movie, another layer is added, another layer of complexity that kind of makes the film more and more interesting. And especially the end. I love the ending, and if you haven't seen the movie, you're just gonna have to watch it and find out what it is. It's a fantastic movie. I think it's very relevant, and it kind of always will, which is why it kind of transcends time. And I don't think there's any fat to trim in terms of story. Nothing feels superfluous. It's just a wonderful study. It's exquisitely directed. I definitely recommend it. It's entertaining. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, the link is below. And you can also like my Facebook page and the link below that. Catch you next time.